This video assumes you've already watched my This is Godherja lore primer video, or have perhaps read the lore for that mod already. If you find yourself at a loss at any point throughout this video, I suggest reading the primer or watching my summary video, and then maybe coming back to this video with a fresh perspective. Today we will focus on the period between 1 IS at the formation of the Aversaria Autokratir, or Empire, if you prefer to call it that, to 246 IS, or the life of Maclea, and her bloody elevation of the Autokratir's office, setting the precedent for the role as it exists today. Part 1. A New Empire. In the beginning, before the founding of Aversary's great empire, the people that first formed it lived in the Aversaria Isles, in independent city-states known as polis. During this time they worshipped a variety of faiths, the primary one being Sodiaxanism, named for an ancient Alfir emperor that the Aversaryans' ancestors once served as human guard for. Over time, due to various dragon, which occupied the world at this time in the thousands, and war-related catastrophe, the polis began to fall or be destroyed, and as a reactionary measure, the Aversaria Autokratir, or human imperium, formed as a loose confederation of polis by warlord magi and various other political groups. These rulers, despite their reluctance to come together at all, recognized that constant dragon and magic-related war mixed with deteriorating diplomatic dealings would only lead to their mutual destructions. The leader of this group would come to be known as the Nicarian, a title adopted from one previously held by Sodiax's highest-ranking personal guard. The title of Nicarian was designed to be temporary, however, granted from the priests of the Sodiaxanism faith. But the last and really only Nicarian ruler declared he would relinquish the title and become Autokratir, a new title meaning law speaker, of the Sodiaxian Empire, to become both a religious and government leader, a first in the Isle government's history. It's important to note that to call oneself an emperor at this time was, in a way, against Sodiaxanism itself, as that title prior to this had been reserved for the emperor god. However, his dictatorship was short-lived, and he died before a true crisis could flourish. For a time, the office of Autokratir fell back to its subordinated state as something akin to a prime minister, and was merely the symbolic head of the polis confederation. They could not field their own army, or raise them without a nearly unanimous vote, nor could they hold land considered part of a pre-existing polis, which was basically the entirety of the empire's borders at this point. This led to obvious friction, as the empire debated on what the true function of the office was in the first place, with some arguing for its dissolution and a return to true independence, others for keeping with the status quo, and some arguing for an increase in its power. The sympathies of the Autokratir to any one of these camps would sway as they were elected from the various groups, but matters remained largely unchanged for several decades due to the vice grip of legal red tape surrounding the positions at this time. Yet as the empire began to expand onto the mainland in the region known as Oedipazia, and then further east into modern-day Opacasia, who they peacefully united with, the power slowly began to shift towards the Autokratir, who maintained relative rule over the new mainland holds and took a majority of their exported income for their own salaries. However, this still did not rectify the issue of standing armies, as, due to ancient Sodiaxian law, only nobles were allowed to carry arms and ride upon dragons, and only they were allowed to field armies. The people of the mainland were likewise viewed as savages and barbarians, unfit to fulfill those roles, so they were unable to become citizens, join, or form an army. I'm going to take a brief pause here to explain how citizenship works, so it's a little easier to understand why it's important in the Empire. Since the Empire is a confederation at this point of polis under what was supposed to be a temporary emergency leader, citizens are defined by anyone who was a member of a city-state, or polis that formed it. The Empire, which had expanded onto the mainland, was full of people who could not legally be citizens, since a city-state had not, in most cases, specifically founded or sponsored one of those territories as a colony. Therefore, none of the legal frameworks or protections were created to serve them being the mainlanders. The Autokratir being in charge of them will come up as an important detail later, but I figured I'd give this basic outline of what a citizen is and what these people are not, which is basically just second-class citizens who have to live under this rule, but they don't have any rights. Anyway, back to the armies. The Autokratir needed individuals to police the region and serve as auxiliaries in times of war, and though they were themselves forbidden from fighting outside their respective regions, their armies could march to war behind dragon riders who fulfilled the laws requiring armies be led by a noble. Yet these dragon riders were not beholden to the same laws in the same way as the Autokratir. Thus, in Aautokratir, which was the mainland capital, the City Watch was used as inspiration to form a new militaristic police force, the Aautokratir Watch. The elevation of the Aautokratir Watch allowed the Autokratir to use dragon-riding nobles to muster large forces and declare virtually anyone within a dragon rider in training and part of their own dynasty. Dragon riding, for those curious, was something that automatically made someone a noble, so the act of elevating someone to a dragon rider in training is why they became noble and why it is a big deal. The Autokratir would use this to their advantage, enlisting dragon riders into their ranks, and subsequently declaring specific formations of that rank, sometimes thousands of individuals strong, as their own personal guard. Over time, this loophole of Sodiaxian law grew to be blatantly illegal as more and more watchmen resembled a fully functioning army, openly carrying weapons regardless of rank, and with many within the ranks openly calling for the elevation of the Autokratir, their benefactor, to higher power. Though the polis protested this growing concern, they could do little illegally but watch as the growing militia forces fashioned themselves as the Imperial Army, though this moniker would not really exist until after the coming Civil War. This group rapidly became the largest military force in the Empire, out of political and economic necessity for law and order in the region. Here we have a powder keg of potential political upheaval, and the catalyst of its inevitable explosive nature would come in the name of Phanagorax. Phanagorax was a man so loathsome and people-pleasing, he was elected to the position of Autokratir precisely because the police governments assumed he would be an agreeable lackey. Unfortunately, they misjudged him. This happens a lot. And almost as soon as he came to power, Phanagorax immediately swallowed as much imperial power he could get his hands on, which wasn't much, as the laws of Aversaria were still ironclad, though he attempted to snake it out of them repeatedly, regardless. Now, normally a guy like this would have been murdered or poisoned were it not for one thing: the Irosi, a group of clan-based raiding peoples from the north of Aautokratir, who, when the empire expanded into their old raiding lands, realized the land was now even more bountiful with plunder, and therefore began raiding the territory with such ravenous tenacity, it led to wholesale slaughter of imperial citizens, or so the imperial rumors went anyway. This caused widespread unrest in Aautokratir and anger in the other parts of the mainland empire. Blame fell squarely on the police, whose refusal to help the people on the mainland and raise or form an army for them, as they were the only legal entity allowed to do so, further burned public opinion of them. Phanagorax took the opportunity to lead a quick campaign north with the Oraspol Watch, who, after a bloody campaign, defeated and enslaved the Irosi, with the last of their rulers being fed to a dragon, and his lands divided up among the imperial forces, who ruled that area for centuries under martial law. Thus, Phanagorax saved his reputation in part due to his ability to take the credit for nearly everyone around him, despite the fact that he was almost a biblically bad military and political leader. Part 2. A New Faith. Before Phanagorax's death, after a rule of over 35 long years, he schemed one last middle finger to the police and gathered religious scholars from across the empire to Oraspol. There they would invent, or rather form, a new faith in hopes of legitimizing the rule of the Autokratir in the eyes of the public. This Thesean ship of religious amalgamation based on the faiths of various barbaric, i.e. non-Aversarian and Aversarian cultures, culminated in the invention of a being known as the Purist, founder of the First Empire, who Phanagorax conveniently proclaimed descent from. Likewise, he declared that the followers of the Purists, the 8 first men, were the founders of the original polis. The Purist was a sort of mix between Arsanon, who we've talked about on the channel before, but in short was the literal creator of the world of Godherja of Eris, and humanity, that humanity subsequently killed, and Sodiax, who we mentioned earlier in this video, which was the Aelfir Emperor. This imperial cult, as we're going to call it for probably the rest of this video, came into maturity well after Phanagorax died, as it initially struggled to find legitimacy in the empire because the next Autokratir, named Memnubian, affirmed his faith in the old Sodiaxian faith instead. However, Memnubian found his new position daunting, as the work of Phanagorax, who ruled for a total of 39 years, were basically illegal in every conceivable way and had done much to weaken the seat of the Autokratir. Likewise, his imperial army, and I'm putting that in quotes, had begun expanding and declaring new polis in Malkuth with little to no recourse, as there were no forces within the collective empire large enough to stand against them. Nor could the emperor without the backing of the polis do much to dissuade their continued expansion. They also began rapidly adopting the imperial cult faith, which only made matters worse. As Phanagorax's descendants, specifically his grandson, Aautokratir, entered the political world, it became more and more apparent that Phanagorax had accidentally created something genius in the imperial cult. For although the legality of imperial citizenship required one to be a citizen of a polis, as we mentioned previously, those who followed the imperial cult were all citizens under the rule of the divine Autokratir. Remember when I said this would come up again? Basically, all these unprotected second-class citizens, or second-class peoples, are now automatically citizens, so long as they subscribe to this faith. That's a recipe for disaster, obviously. The descendants of Phanagorax then proclaimed themselves his reincarnations, therefore descendants of, or literal reincarnations of, the Purist, claiming they had returned to rule the Second Empire, the first having been destroyed in the Godherja, although this specific memory was only loosely remembered in the echoes of the imperial cults, and I talked about that in my lore video. It's very likely this word of First Empire was merely stolen from the Sodiaxian faith's Aelfir Emperor god, but it's not really worth expanding on to understand this thread. In essence, the imperial cultists managed to legitimize their faith with the aid of a very popular Eastern Mountain Sun Temple faith in Aautokratir, a region I mentioned previously who had joined with the empire willingly. This mix of popular mysticism and their traditions allowed for this rapid growth in just a few years, because it basically was just like a culmination of a bunch of popular, already practiced faiths and in-style things. Memnubian died after 19 years of rule, thank God, because his name is hard to say, and some suspect as a result of magic, but that's here nor there. And a young man named Dasixin took over as yet another Sodiaxian follower and supporter of the polis, yet he was also a dragon rider, and considered the idea of mainland citizenship appealing. Therefore, we can view him as a sort of would-be reformer emperor that wanted to do good by both sides without rocking the boat too much. But this kind facade was not what got him elected in the first place, as his shrewd and occasionally cutthroat strong-arming of political parties in the polis all but guaranteed his election, with virtually no say going to the mainland, which caused understandable unrest in the region. His rule would last just 5 years, and end in utter catastrophe. Though he was in the eyes of most an incredibly capable statesman, nothing he could have done would have fixed the growing schism between the polis and the mainland. When Phanagorax's grandson, Exianorax, led a mutiny within the imperial army and declared himself Autokratir, the realm at last fell to a civil war, which would forever after be known as the War of the Thousand Dragons. The war, which was meant to be short and efficient, would last for 14 years, with 2/3 of the polis siding with Dasixin and the remaining alongside the mainlanders siding with Exianorax. As their dragons flew and armies marched, the lands were devastated. Swarms of dragons, now riderless from the war, began gathering across the world and ravaging anything in their path. Thousands within the empire fell to the chaos, with many left wandering the ashes of the dragon fire-born destruction. As smoke filled the skies across the empire, the land below cooled, destroying the agriculture and local fauna therein. All told, the chaos stretched from the Isles to the mainland and as far south as the deserts of Ceridon. In the end, it was Dasixin, atop his dragon Antarianax, reportedly the king of all dragonkin, who called for a truce with Exianorax, a sacred rite under Ersodiaxian faith. Unfortunately for Dasixin, Exianorax used this as an opportunity to declare Ersodiaxianism a dead and false faith, and that their barbaric rituals and customs did not apply to him. Dasixin, his personal guard, and his dragon were thus captured in Exianorax's war camp after surrender. There, they were sent to Oraispol, where they were tortured publicly and magically for days at the city gates, and afterwards executed. The city of Oraispol, when the siege in the town finally ended, was torn down, though this happens a lot, so don't worry, it's still there. And this is generally seen as the end of the War of the Thousand Dragons, although its repercussions would ripple on for generations afterwards. Part 3. The Last Ersodiaxians. When Exianorax officially took the throne, he began his rule by hunting down the remnants of the Ersodiaxian resistant fighters, before declaring that the catastrophic, near-apocalyptic force of the dragons which ravaged the empire during every war needed a permanent solution, i.e. their utter extermination. This was an unprecedented idea, as dragon riders and their dragons formed a bond closer than that between siblings, and riders could even communicate with their dragons freely. But to show his resolve, Exianorax had his own dragon and their hatchlings slaughtered, and the dragon riders he had following him did the same. Over the next 20 years, he and his armies would hunt down the last of the dragons. Ersodiaxianism, which had lost virtually all political favor during the war, fell into a permanent political obscurity thanks in part to the dragon's death, but mostly because people just wanted them out of politics after the costly war. Though they would still exist and in fact worship their old faith as a sort of gray area in the empire for a few decades more, this is effectively the end of their importance in the empire's history, although they will come up again because they're about to all die. After 18 years of struggling rule, this being a period of widespread depression due to the war's effects, Exianorax died, and it quickly became apparent that none of the reasons the empire went to war in the first place were solved. The Autokratir was still not firmly established, as it was only loosely held up by religious doctrine, which was not even universally agreed on by its followers. The realm was in ruins, and the citizenship question was left unanswered. These, plus a myriad of other political questions, would be kicked forward by subsequent Autokratir for decades, until the rise of a woman named Maclea, who was as beautiful and competent as she was psychopathic. Maclea's father, an Autokratir himself, tired of the bickering of his sons as to who should rule after him, proclaimed while on campaign to end a rebellion that whichever of his male heirs was the strongest magi, he would be his new heir. Maclea, despite obviously being excluded from this conversation by way of being a woman, took the throne by killing her father and brothers almost immediately after he had finished saying this. This would be seen as the first Blood Senate, debates which lead to magical duels for the seat of Autokratir. Maclea then subsequently murdered anyone she suspected of being a loyalist of her father or brothers, until they proclaimed her Autokratia. She then killed every living member of her family, and most of the previous Autokratir's families, to secure her legitimacy in a period known as Maclea's Purges. Maclea would go on to destroy the remnants of the Ersodiaxians, and pretty much any faith and culture within the empire which didn't benefit her power in some capacity. Those which she deemed worthy, however, she protected with the same violence. Though Maclea would eventually be poisoned, big surprise, her systematic purging and replacement of everyone in power to either lackeys or lovers created what would become the modern Aversarian government, one subservient to the Autokratir above all else. And through her competent skills of negotiation, we'll call it, created the Autokratir governor nobility power structure that would endure to the fall of the empire. And there you have it, the death of Ersodiaxianism and the rise of the Autokratir in all its bloody glory. And that's it for this one. I want to thank you so much for watching. I want to thank the lead developer, Lonely Knightess, for assisting me with writing the script. I would not have been able to do this without you. It was quite a big task to try to wrangle all this up in a under 20-minute video, and I think I did a pretty good job with that. So I want to thank you for helping me revise it and make corrections when necessary. Obviously, if you like Godherja as a mod and you want to support them, they do have a Patreon, and I also just recommend going on the Discord and chatting with them. They're very, 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 very nice group, and I like to hang out there sometimes too. If you like this video, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, because it helps me and YouTube know that you like this sort of content and you'd like to see more of it. If you do like this content and you would like to support it in some way, I do have memberships on the channel. There are 2 different tiers. You can see that here. I want to thank all the members for being here, and that's it for me. So thank you so much for watching. This has been a time of life and death, the founding of Aversaria and the rise of the Autokratir. I'm Sol, and I will happily see you in the next one.